Hello and welcome to Gravity Games, as well as the first episode of Niche Reviews, where we will try to give a more fair review to less popular games. The game we'll be reviewing today is Drakengard 3 for the PlayStation 3. Drakengard 3 is a difficult game to review. It has this strange feeling of being so close to a great game, yet so far away at the same time. Often when the game takes a step forward, it likes to take 2 steps back, or do something to get in the way of the overall enjoyment of the game. With that being said, I did actually enjoy my time with the game very much, and I think critics were overall a little bit too harsh on the experience. However, that being said, this game is very far from perfect. Since this is a video game, I've always found graphics fairly important to the overall experience. While it definitely doesn't define the game, I do find that the aesthetic value of a visual medium is pretty important. Which is why I'm saying this, because the first thing you notice when you boot up Drakengard 3 is that it is a very ugly game. Low resolution visuals, no anti-aliasing, poor textures, average character models, and a very bland color palette. There's also severe frame rate issues at times that have gotten so bad it's actually affected the gameplay and even gotten me killed. However, it is usually tolerable. It gets most finicky when your dragon is involved or a lot of magic effects are on the screen. I've honestly seen better looking games and better running games on PS2. One thing I think critics might have been a little bit too harsh on was the camera. While it's not amazing, it's about as good as any other hack and slash game. So it's pretty much hit and miss at times. But thanks to a fairly competent lock-on system, it's really not so bad. I only got frustrated about as much as I did in any other game like DMC or Killer is Dead. The level design in Drakengard 3 is nothing special, but it's not terrible either. Basically, it's passable, and it gets the job done, although the game does feel a little bit too linear in its level design. But sometimes there's actually a standout level or two that can be fairly interesting. There's also quite a bit of variation to the areas you do visit, such as a forest, a snowy mountaintop, a desert, or even more urban settings. However, I feel this was kind of ruined by the fact that you're forced to eventually play through some of these areas several times, in the most tedious of manner. Even the most interesting areas get dull after witnessing them a couple times. And then there's the bad ones you have to play over, such as a desert that slowly drains your health as you walk through it, possibly the longest level in the game, and you have to go there like 3 times. There's a bunch of extra side missions called requests that add a good amount of gameplay time. However, once again, this game's attempts to do something good are held back by design flaws. Literally every single side mission in the game, besides 4 survival missions, are timed fetch quests, where you basically have to beat up a bunch of enemies until they drop the items you need, or run around breaking chests for these items. Some of these are actually extremely frustrating, which would be okay if you weren't forced to do them. The complete lack of any variation in these side missions is quite disappointing. I know what you're thinking, how are they side missions if you're forced to do a lot of them? Allow me to explain that. At a certain point in the game, you will be forced to acquire every single weapon in the game to progress. This requires you to open almost every single chest throughout the campaign, earn hundreds of thousands of gold, and do almost all of these requests. This also means you will be forced in replaying the same areas multiple times. Nothing in this game bothered me more than this. When you're finally getting engaged in the gameplay and story, they basically put a barrier up and say, fuck you, completely disrespecting your time and patience while artificially adding a significant amount of hours to the game. It's just poor design in general, in my opinion. You know, I fully expect someone to say, oh boo-hoo, you have to work for your ending. Well, in my opinion, it's a fucking game, not work. I don't play games to be bored and pissed off and do tedious tasks. I just want to play to have fun. Drakengard's 3 story is decent, and can actually be fairly interesting at times. But at first it comes off as a kind of immature game that features pee jokes and sexual jokes, as well as profound amounts of vulgarity. Zero comes off as a 13-year-old going through puberty who just learned about the word fuck. She's pointlessly mean to the other characters, especially her dragon Mikhail and the disciples who join you on your adventure. The story at the beginning seems to be about her going off on a pointless rampage to kill all of her sisters and gain power and take over the world or some shit like that. It takes all of the way until you see the credits roll for the first time that things finally start to piece together and make a little bit of sense, and to actually understand Zero's true motives. She also starts to gain some semblance of a personality beyond being a giant cunt. She also gains some emotions towards her disciples and Mikhail, albeit nothing too deep. She basically goes from heartless to sympathetic in seconds. But at least by the end of the game, things start to get a little bit more interesting, and things just start to pick up. But don't expect it to win any awards or anything. Despite a lot of those negatives I stated earlier, I can actually forget a lot of those, because the gameplay is actually really enjoyable. And some would argue that's all that really matters in a game. It's a lot of fun feeling incredibly powerful, destroying hordes of enemies with Dynasty Warrior style combat. It's fast-paced and fun to watch, and while it's not the deepest combat on Earth, it's not completely shallow either. You can initiate well-timed parries, do launch combos, as well as specific chains between light and heavy attacks that do different combos. There's also Intoner mode, which a lot of other games in the genre seem to have something similar, where you basically enter a mode where you're super fast and powerful and invulnerable, and I would think of it as this game's Devil Trigger. In terms of general complexity of the gameplay, I'd rate it somewhere between Killer is Dead and Metal Gear Rising. But in all the time I played the game, I surprisingly never got bored with the combat, even though I can admit that it's fairly repetitive and not the deepest game ever. It kept me going through some of the less enjoyable parts of the game. You also have AI disciples who battle alongside with you, but honestly they're completely brain dead and literally don't help you at all. Luckily you don't need them since you can completely kick ass by yourself. The game also features a decent weapon system, with 4 types of weapons and over 60 weapons in total. You can swap between these weapons on the fly, and you can even switch between them to change up your strategy and beat certain types of enemies. It's actually not bad. The soundtrack also adds a lot to the combat and helps you feel like a real badass. And it's also possibly one of the best parts of the game. It's a shame the rest of the game couldn't have the presentation quality the soundtrack does. Aerial combat with Mikhail, unfortunately, is not as good. And this is where a lot of the problems critics stated come into play, such as awful frame rate and poor camera. It's just terribly executed in general. You will literally dread every time you have to fight with Mikhail, and a lot of the boss fights are on Dragon. However, there are some on-rails style segments with no third-dimensional world control that aren't too bad. They kind of feel like a shitty, watered-down homage to Panzer Dragoon or something like that. Alright, last but not least, and I know I'm gonna get some flack for this, but honestly, I'm okay with that. The last boss in this game, air quotes on the word boss, is possibly the worst boss I've ever seen in a video game. And if you can, I highly suggest if you get to it, just cheat on it, because it's literally unfair. Luckily, people have made tools and guides so you don't have to waste hours of your life being frustrated over an obnoxious, obvious troll job of a boss. Call me a casual, I don't care. I just don't like to waste my time on bullshit. As for my final verdict of the game, I do have to say it's a very, very flawed experience. But it's a fun, flawed experience, and that actually makes up for a lot of the downsides. I mean, there's no reason it should look like a game that came out on the PS2 and couldn't run any better. There's no reason a lot of the questionable mechanics and design couldn't been ironed out. But I really enjoyed my time with the game in general, and even if it was frustrating at times and not the best game ever. I don't regret the time or money I put into this game by any means. But with that being said, I couldn't really classify it as a must-play, and it's definitely not for everyone. And you're gonna need a lot of patience. As I've said earlier, it's so close to being an awesome game, yet so far away at the same time. I would give this game a solid 7 out of 10, mostly just running off the gameplay alone. And if you're bored this summer during the inevitable game drought, maybe give it a try, but heed my warnings. Thanks for watching, and please comment, like, subscribe, and all that good stuff.
Knock it off! How many times have I told you? Don't roll around in the fucking mud!